This is 9/11 Free Fall.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of 9/11 Free Fall. My name is Andy Steele, and I am the host. Tonight, we'll be joined by Fran Shure. The latest installment in her essay series called Why Do Good People Become Silent or Worse About 9/11 is due to be out. This one covers CIA manipulation, control of the media. Very important topic. Of course, that plays heavily into why some people refuse to look into the World Trade Center evidence. We go a little in-depth in this interview. The article goes even more in-depth, so I encourage everybody to check it out. It's all coming your way in just a moment.
We was in the lobby and the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was like, if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
We have explosive demolition at not only the Twin Towers, but also Building 7.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
You want to call your mother or something?
It's just a matter of time. That's all it is. It's a matter of time and the persistence of those who continue to adhere to it and push for it. And that's what we're doing.
Tune in to 9/11 Free Fall, a show about 9/11 truth, 9/11 science, and the activists and scholars who are blowing the lid off the crime of the century. You can download episodes at 911freefall.com.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Fran Shure has worked as a business owner, a licensed professional counselor specializing in depth psychology, and an adjunct instructor at Naropa University. She has long worked for world peace and a sustainable environment. She's the co-founder of Colorado 9/11 Truth and is one of the 9/11 Consensus panel members. She's listed with medical professionals for 9/11 Truth, and she's the author of a serial essay called Why Do Good People Become Silent or Worse About 9/11. She'll be talking about the latest installment in that series today, part 22. This is a topic that I'm very interested in. Fran, welcome back to 9/11 Free Fall.
Thank you so much, Andy. Good to be here.
So, we're going to get into your latest article. I've read it, and as I just said, I find this whole aspect of what we're up against fascinating. I don't know if fascinating is a good word to describe it, but I wonder about the nuts and bolts of how the censorship machine works. But before we get into that, because it's been a long time since you have been on this show, please tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and your career before getting into 9/11.
Well, you actually covered a lot of it. I've worked as a business owner and also as a psychotherapist, working with depth psychology, which means the unconscious is taken into consideration. I've worked a lot with trauma, especially very early trauma, pre-verbal trauma. And so that's really where my main expertise is. And then I got involved with 9/11. You know, actually on the day of 9/11, when I was watching the buildings come down in New York, I found myself blurting out, I don't think this could have happened without somebody knowing about it and allowing it to happen. So, but I did believe the official story and became involved really right away. As soon as I saw Michael Rupert's video, Truth and Lies About 9/11, I started digging into it. So that was how I got started. And then actually my main interest, besides, studying the facts, trying to winnow the things that were not true from the things that were true, the real facts, the real evidence. But then I became very interested in why this is so difficult for people. And it was difficult for me, but I got through it, and I was just amazed at some of the responses I was getting from people. So what I did, Andy, I was puzzled by all these responses I was getting to people, so I started documenting them. And I started writing down all these spontaneous responses that people would give me when I brought up the subject of 9/11. One example being, Fran, you can't expect people to listen to evidence that turns their world upside down. And so I documented all of these spontaneous responses, and that's how I got started thinking about this whole, applying my psychology background, basically, to the whole 9/11 event.
If you look at our movie, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, just about everybody in the beginning of that movie is an engineer or an architect talking about the evidence, but there is a segment that is added to it that goes outside of our scope as architects and engineers, but is very relevant to this issue, which is the psychiatrists and psychologists who talk about public resistance to hearing facts about this issue. I'll tell you what, Fran, every once in a while I'm reminded of how tough it is out there for people. I work here and I'm surrounded by so many people that are awake to this that you kind of, I'm not in a bubble, but you tend to sometimes forget how the general public will sometimes react. But every once in a while there's a reminder, or you'll hear the kind of responses that you have talked about in previous installments of this series. And it's so important because if it was just a simple question of logic and presenting evidence, we wouldn't need to be here. We'd be doing something else with our time instead of talking about the same issue over and over again. The evidence doesn't change, it stays the same because that's what all the facts point to, is the fact that these buildings were brought down in controlled demolitions, but it's overcoming these psychological barriers that people put up, or these knee-jerk reactions to having something presented to an individual that challenges their worldview that really keeps us where we are. We've made a lot of improvement over the many years since we've existed, other 9/11 groups have existed, but there's still a lot more progress to be made. And so that's why we need the help of people like you to consult with and to put out articles like this. In previous installments, you've talked about the psychological aspect. There's a lot of great reading out there. If you're a listener and you're new to Fran Shure and to her series, a lot of great reading material for you to catch up on in the previous installments. But can you tell our audience just some of the articles that you have written as part of the series in the past that has led up to this part 22 where we're talking about the media control and the CIA?
Right. The first thing I did was I started exploring the psychological research, basically that shows why all of us as human beings have a difficult time with evidence that contradicts our worldview, which is basically what we're up against with 9/11. I start out in part 2, actually, after the introduction, with an anthropological research called Diffusion of Innovations, in which it shows that any culture, it doesn't matter what culture it is, it can be a very primitive culture, very traditional culture, it can be a very industrialized culture, but in any culture, they find that there's a neat bell curve of people, starting with about 2.5% being innovators. They're the first people who latch on to a new idea and start promoting it. And then the early adopters, 13.5%, on and on, until the very last of that bell curve is the laggards, the 16% who will never change their minds. I talk about authority, the authority experiments by Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo, and a really interesting one by a third grade teacher, Jane Elliott. I talk about a doublethink from 1984, George Orwell's very brilliant concept of doublethink. That's not a psychological research, but I thought it was so brilliant I had to include it. Denial and cognitive dissonance, which is so important and such a basic concept that we all need to know about. conformity, how as human beings, we're really all, basically we're conformists, and that's how we keep our society intact, is by conforming. But it becomes maladaptive when we get into certain types of conformity, like groupthink, where we have a group of people who will not open their minds to any evidence other than their cherished beliefs. There's also the brain research that shows that we have different brains. Some people have brains that are more open to new evidence than other people. Our brains are wired to stick with our beliefs. We become very attached to our beliefs, and that's a survival mechanism. We're also wired to be moral, and unless we're true sociopaths, we're all very moral. We have mirror neurons, which says we can empathize with other people. We don't want to see them hurt or killed. It goes on. I talk about how it's easier for people to grasp onto the 9/11 evidence if they've studied other state crimes against democracy. For example, the assassination of JFK. If they know about MKUltra. If they know about these things, it's easier for them to grasp 9/11. If they don't know, they've got a bigger hill to climb. Learned helplessness, psychological research, where when we have certain trauma, especially at an early age, we develop behavior of learned helplessness, which means, and I've heard this so often with people, it says, I just can't do, this is just too big for me. I can't deal with this. I've got to deal with something that's not so big, something I can deal with. I talk about the battled citizen syndrome or the abuse syndrome, how when we're abused, we tend to then bond with parental figures who abuse us. And we're being abused by our government constantly, but we keep believing them and bonding with them. I talk about the false self, when we don't have a strong sense of self. And then we might tend to excessively identify with our country. In other words, the U.S. is always a good country. We always do good things, and we identify with that image of our country. And one of the segments, one of the essays I like the most was talking about the big lie and how the quote from Hitler about people will tend to believe a big lie more than a small lie. And I go in detail in what happened in Nazi Germany, and I actually compare that to what's happening now in the U.S. With 9/11. 9/11 being a big lie. We just can't believe that our parental figures, our authorities, would lie to such a colossal extent. That was one of the ones I learned the most about when I was doing this research. So American exceptionalism and nationalist faith, that's a really important one, because this I learned so much from David Ray Griffin on this, where all of us tend to believe that America is the exceptional country, that our leaders would not do anything intentionally that would be harmful to Americans especially, whereas our history shows the opposite. And then to nationalist faith, where we, no matter how religious we may think we are, we can have more faith in our government than our religion. I also write about true sociopaths, those people who totally lack, are not capable of empathy or conscience, which is really fascinating. So as I was writing all this, the editors of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth said, well, Fran, I think you need to talk more about the media, because that's the main reason that people are silent or worse about 9/11. And I've been writing about it all along, talking about the media, and I resisted for a long time. I said, that's just not my area of expertise. I don't want to write about the media in detail, but they talked me into it. So it's taken me quite a while to do the research and to look into the media. So it's going to be at least 4 segments of this long essay, the serial essay. The first segment was on whatever happened to investigative journalists. So I delve into that in quite a bit of detail. Why don't we have real investigative journalists working for mainstream media? Even alternative media doesn't have real investigative journalists often. And the next segment, I was going to write about the structure of the media as being one of the reasons why the media does not address 9/11. But as I got into that whole research, I started researching the CIA and their role in the media, and it was so extensive and so well documented that I decided it deserved a whole segment of its own. So this next upcoming essay installment will be called The Special Role of the CIA in Our Media. So that's a long story of how I got to where I am.
Well, I think it's a great place to be at right now because, first of all, you talk about how some people are one way, other people are another way. It makes me wonder, why are we on this show doing this, and why is somebody else saying this is too big for me, or just outright saying they don't care about this issue? Can you just take a moment, and from a psychologist's point of view, what makes up these personalities? Because I don't know, and I don't presume to understand everyone else. Is it just life experience as you're growing up? Certain things happen to you? They give you a certain perspective on the world or more willingness to take on an issue like this?
There's so many answers to that question, and it's all going to depend on the individual we're talking about. Let's say we're talking about an individual who we talked about brain structure, about the brain. This is one of the areas of research that I have spoken about in this serial essay, and how important beliefs are. So let's say we have a brain structure that's not very open to new information, and along with that, let's say we've been brought up to not think critically. Most of us are not taught to think critically. We're taught to regurgitate information in our schools and in our families. And let's say on top of that, we're brought up in a very religious environment, but one in which faith in our nation is primary. It's going to be really hard to reach that person. So that person's probably not going to be immediately anyway in the middle of the 9/11 truth movement. And that person, once they do accept the information, if they ever do, they would be a person who would go through a lot of trauma just learning about this information. They would have to be confronting so many of the concepts that they've been brought up with. But then there's another type of person, let's say a person who is innately curious and open to new information, but discerning, and also has not been brought up in such a rigid environment, and also has along the way studied other aspects, other dark sides of our American history. That person's going to be more open. And so, like I said, it just depends on the person we're talking to. And I'm sure each of us in the 9/11 Truth Movement now would have our own story as to what we had to go through to get where we are.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the different kinds of strata of people out there in the public. Because there's even people who I wouldn't call truthers, but they agree with us. They just say that there's nothing you can do about it. Governments have always been corrupt. You might as well just watch the football or the movies and have fun and not worry about it. But something crafts those attitudes, and that's what makes life so interesting. So let's get to the CIA and media manipulation. I think this is a huge element. I think our actually number one enemy is not NIST. It's not necessarily the government. It's the media. The media can make or break someone. If they don't like a certain politician or celebrity suddenly, they can go full-on assault and at least give the projection that everybody else in America dislikes this person, and then it becomes like the self-fulfilling prophecy. They have a lot of power, is what I'm saying here. And what fascinated me from the beginning was seeing how in lockstep, once it was pointed out to me, seeing how in lockstep the media is. Now, there's issues that they'll gripe over, acceptable issues of debate, but when it comes to things like 9/11, they'll be in lockstep on this, and not based on any kind of logical argument, because they'll do the same kinds of techniques of misrepresenting the facts, hurling insults, all of that, both on the right media, the left media. They'll both do the same thing. I mean, we can see that the media is controlled by someone. I've always wondered who that is, how that works. So that's an intro, and the article, I don't know if it'll be up by the time the show airs. It may or may not be, but it will be up shortly. I want everybody to take the time to read this, but give us an overview of Part 22, Fran.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll start from where I ended with Part 21, which was who and what is controlling the media. And by studying especially, quite a few different sources, but especially Christina Borgeson's absolutely amazing book called Into the Buzzsaw, what I've done is I looked at each one. It's an edited, she's the editor of the book. She also contributes to the book. And by looking at each of the contributors and their stories about how their very worthwhile stories were censored from the press, I came up with a list from those people of who and what was censoring these award-winning journalists, many of them. And what we found was the censorers were the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, military intelligence, media owners, the White House, advertisers, especially large advertisers, powerful family dynasties, and extremely wealthy individuals. So this list comes from their experiences of who and what censored their stories. So from there, as I was starting to look into the structure of the media. But as I was looking into the CIA more, I realized that they deserved a section all devoted to the CIA. So what we'll find in this next Part 22 coming up is basically, you're going to find, first of all, it's going to start with a story, a personal story of an altercation I had with a New York Times journalist, public altercation, in which he really dresses me down for asking a question about how the CIA might be involved in the media. He laughs at me, he gets the audience laughing at me, and I wound up quieting everybody down by asking them all to look into Operation Mockingbird. And he's never heard of it, he doesn't know what it is, and laughs at me more. And then, interestingly enough, as he exits the stage, an activist friend of mine hands him Carl Bernstein's paper called How the CIA, let me just see if I can pull that up, what the exact title of that is. The CIA and the Media, How America's Most Powerful News Media Worked Hand in Glove with the CIA and Why the Church Committee Covered It Up. So he grasped the article and marched off the stage. But at any rate, so it starts off with his personal story. And then I go into, okay, well, was there an Operation Mockingbird? Maybe I'm just wrong, and maybe I need to look into this. So I first go into this, in this next segment, I go into the history. First of all, I answer the question, was there Operation Mockingbird? Yes, there was. There was an Operation Mockingbird. It's well established. It's well documented by congressional hearings. But there is no official saying that the project was called Operation Mockingbird. So the term Operation Mockingbird came from a book called Catherine the Great by Deborah Davis. And her source said that there was an Operation Mockingbird, but we don't have a source validating that. So yes, there was such a program to control the media by the CIA, but there was no official sanctioning of that name. So I looked into, okay, how did all this get started? Well, with a history. It got started with journalists working with the OSS, the precursor to the CIA during World War II. And it was a very patriotic duty for journalists to work with the CIA. And once it became the CIA in 1947, they kept working with the CIA. And I look at how Philip Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, actually started working with Frank Wisner to develop a program in which basically all media of any significance would be controlled by the CIA. And people all over the world would be receiving propaganda from the CIA, and that propaganda would wind back up into our American media, so Americans would be propagandized by the CIA. So that's in a very small nutshell, that is the history.
The Cold War played a big hand in the creation of what we see now, what it eventually emerged into, because they were afraid of communist propaganda getting out in various media, so that they had to create a bunch of organizations and front publications that would promote the capitalist message to preserve our way of life here.
Exactly. The communists were, from what I can see, a real threat. Stalin was taking over much of Eastern Europe. There were a lot of communist front organizations that were spreading the communist message. And, the communists weren't democratic. So it was quite a concern to people in our government. So what happened was Frank Wisner and Philip Graham, all overseen by George Kennan, who was overseeing all of this, who was the father of the theory, the strategy of containment, of containing communism and trying to roll it back. They developed front groups basically modeled after the communist front groups. So they would try to join with what they call the compatible left in Europe and eventually in other countries to convince them that capitalism was the way to go, not communism. So they became a voice for the ideology of capitalism rather than the ideology of communism. So that's how that all got started. And it was very, very successful until several things happened. Ramparts magazine in 1967 published an expose on how the CIA was funding the National Student Organization. So that was really very, very explosive. And then the newspapers were tripping over themselves, exposing more front organizations, how the CIA had their tentacles into so many organizations that people thought were just innocent organizations working for democracy. And then Seymour Hersh published in the New York Times in 1974 an expose on the spying of the anti-war activists. This was during the Vietnam era. So that was what stimulated 3 official investigations. It was President Ford at the time established 3 investigative units, one the Rockefeller Commission, the Otis Pike with the House of Representatives, and the Church Committee. And then they were all looking into how has the CIA and the FBI gone beyond their authority, and basically have they committed crimes against American people. And of course their verdict was a resounding yes, they have committed crimes against the American people. One small part, the Otis Pike Commission was actually very disturbing, and it was so disturbing that it was never published officially, but it was leaked. So it got leaked to the Village Voice, and then it got published in its entirety in England, I believe. And then the Church Committee, they were investigating in general how the FBI and the CIA, what crimes they might have committed against the American people. One small part of their investigation was to look into the media. But they found when they did, they opened a can of worms, and their investigation into the media produced so much more than they ever expected to find, both the media and academia. They found that both the media and the academia were just incredibly infiltrated with CIA agents and journalists and academia working for the CIA. So it wound up being quite the expose, but in their report, they really downplayed everything. In the Church Committee report, they downplayed everything and didn't report on what they had actually discovered.
Well, I think the smartest thing that anyone can do is turn their television set off, and if you want to get entertainment, go to the streaming services, exercise a little freedom of choice there, and do the same thing with your media. But they're starting to strangle the alternative media, too, through the internet. I want to read a quick segment from your article for our audience, and then I have a commentary to follow. The segment says, "The aforementioned Dr. Bader, who had supervised the inquiries into both the media's and academia's covert dealings with the CIA, and who wrote those segments of the report, concurred with these restrictions. He said he felt he had entered a gray area in which there were no moral absolutes. What did he mean? For one thing, Bader recognized that the CIA's charter did not prohibit it from being involved with the press or with academics. No, for that matter, with any other institutions, such as corporations and U.S. diplomats under whom it had sought cover over the years. just goes to show that the CIA doesn't just do what it needs to do to stop threats to national security. These instances where they step over the line are not just instances where there was some grave threat that they had to do it, like they portray on TV. They'll say, 17 nuclear bombs are going to go off unless we spy on everybody's phone. And then people have that worked into their brain that, oh no, this stuff is justified because maybe someday somewhere they'll have 17 nuclear bombs about to go off. They're playing lawyer with this charter and doing whatever they can, sort of like a kid saying, well, you didn't say I couldn't do this. And to me, it just shows this is an institution that's gone way beyond its mission of gathering intelligence, protecting the United States, and this is all about power and control now. I mean, if you're supposed to be collecting intelligence on enemy governments, that's one thing. If you are using your resources, and seemingly unlimited from what I've witnessed and just looking at the reach of it, but using your resources to propagandize the public and working with media and working with entertainment, which we'll get into in just a moment. I mean, this is like a crime family. Something with way too much power to do this. I'm just curious about what your thoughts on that commentary.
Right, absolutely. You can see when you look at the history of how the CIA and journalists joined forces in World War II, you can see the logic in that. The countries at war, we're fighting for our lives here. You can see the logic in the media joining with the CIA, or as the OSS at the time, to help us win this war, But what happened, and then there was this huge threat of communism. So there was all this fear, and whether that was played up more than it was an actual threat or not, I have not investigated. But people thought it was a real threat, and there is indication that it was. You can see how there's some logic in that too. But what has happened is their power has grown to the point where they have immunity to anything they do. In fact, now by law, it has grown by leaps and bounds here in these last decades, so that now they are actually by law cannot be held accountable for anything they do to anything, as long as they have orders from somewhere in the CIA agents can do anything they want to do, and they will not ever be held accountable by law. And that was legalized. It was actually the Intelligence Authorization Act of fiscal year 2001, Section 308, in which they were granted legal immunity for anything they did, as long as it was under orders. So this can't be constitutional or legal, these laws, because you can't do things that are illegal. That's basically illegal. No one can sign off to crimes. The Congress can't sign off to crimes. It's just crazy, the kind of power that they've gotten, and now it's enshrined in law. They're also, by 2012, there was the Smith-Moot Modernization Act. In 1948, Smith-Moot Act said that Americans could not be propagandized by our intelligence agencies. But then that was modernized, quote unquote, in 2012. And it said that now the CIA or anyone, the CIA, the Pentagon, the White House, the Broadcasters Bureau of Governors, any entity like this can propagandize American citizens, and it is completely legal now. So they can assassinate Americans, and they get by with it, even in this country. So their power has grown so that they are a state within a state, basically. They are not held accountable by anyone. So, yeah, it started off innocently as far as I can see, but the power has grown and grown, and it kind of reminds me of the saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Well, we created our own monster to fight what we perceived as a monster at one time, but it ends up turning on us, and that is what you got to watch out for. And anytime you're running a business or anything in your life, and you take protective measures, you got to make sure that protective measure doesn't somehow turn around on you and start going after you. I love how they call it the Modernization Act, as if somehow propagandizing in a fascist style is modern. Maybe they'll have the next one be called the Futurization Act, where they're allowed to propagandize the public, but somehow they prevent me from having this show and from you having a platform to write your essays. That'll be the Futurization Act in their minds. But I see a better future, and I want a better future. That's why we're doing what we're doing. This is an interesting part of this, the entertainment industry. I can see it. I mean, look, there's some people who just get it and some people who don't. I get it. I watch everything. I will watch stuff that is trying to convince me of the other side of particular arguments. I mean, there hasn't really been an anti-9/11 truth movie that I know about. Maybe someone out there is familiar with something that I'm not. But I've seen things about the Kennedy assassination, trying to reinforce the official story. And it's not just laying out the facts as they see it. I mean, they will go to great lengths to portray a particular character that may be representing the other side of it, and try to find the squirreliest looking actor that they can, and cast this person to give a picture to the general public of how you should envision people who raise these arguments. I mean, I on one level I find it entertaining because it's so obvious, and I think that the other side to me is like really bad at it. However, there's people that fall for this and go along with it. And then you see the obvious propaganda films. I have not seen Zero Dark 30. That's one I just haven't gotten a chance to watch, but from what I've heard, that's a real propaganda movie trying to reinforce the Bin Laden raid narrative. So many things like this out there. So it's very apparent that they do that. There was a Law and Order SVU that was trying to make 9/11 truth advocates look like crazy people who are living in garages and sitting in restaurants with their back to the wall because someone might get them. Anyone who says that they're not trying to put themes in shows, of course they are. I mean, it's been done openly for other issues. They were trying to get themes about Obamacare into shows. This came out in the news. So to claim that it's not happening at all is really uninformed because it's acknowledged that it happens. But talk about this, the fact that we have CIA wrapped up in the entertainment industry.
Right. And this there is a section in the upcoming essay about Hollywood, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the NSA. And yes, the CIA has been involved in the entertainment industry for quite a long time. There has been an expose by two people, Matthew Alford and Tom Secker. They've received 4,000 pages of documents from the Department of Defense under the Freedom of Information Act. And there was much that was withheld, but from what the pages that they got, they have found that there are hundreds and hundreds of films and TV shows that have been approved by the CIA or the Pentagon. And even the NSA is getting in on the act now. And yes, we notice this all the time, and it's very much so, as you pointed out, so much of the theme of some of these movies are basically pro-war. Even sometimes when they look like they're anti-war, they're really, if you look at it, they're really pro-war. This has been going on for a long time. There is, for a long, long time, there's also been the demonization of Muslims. I hope I can remember the name of the film. It's Real, R-E-E-L, Real Bad Arabs. There's a documentary on that about how Hollywood has demonized Muslims and Arabs for decades now, and even way before 9/11. And of course, now they're even more demonized. And of course, that's one of the main reasons that we do the work we do, is that we've got a new scapegoat in our society, the Muslims. So we have a people who are scared for their lives if they're living in this country because they're so demonized. It's really an atrocity.
And I'm sure that there's somebody listening who will say, well, I saw a particular movie where a Muslim was a good guy. Well, if you look at the movies, though, generally, what they'll always portray, if it's a movie about geopolitical issues overseas, they will always project the American side as being a tier above the people involved. Like, there'll be sympathy for people caught up in a war zone and all of that, but there's never really any question that American presence in a certain region is justified. If they do it, it's handled in a very milquetoast kind of way. And for a lot of people in Hollywood, too, they're not really trying to put out a message. I mean, there's some people that are trying to put forth a message to the public about some societal issue, but generally speaking, if it's stuff that involves lots of explosions and military helicopters, like an alien invasion movie, they are really just looking to make a summer blockbuster, make lots of money, and get what they can from it, and they want to get the military cooperation because it's a lot easier, all the stuff's ready to go, military will help out, but you got to get approved. You got to get your script approved by the U.S. military in order to get that cooperation, and if the end goal is not really to put out a message, but to just make a lot of explosions and excitement for an audience, I see how they just automatically comply with it. Why would you question it?
Exactly. Yes, and but yeah, it's I don't know what to say about it. It's really very discouraging to me to see these movies where you recognize the propaganda going on in these B movies that so many people are watching.
Right. Well, it's good to watch the independent films when you can find them. And there's a lot of good artists out there. You get this impression that nobody has a good imagination anymore, that nobody can write a good script anymore if you just watch some of the garbage that's put out there. But if you actually, go to the back corner of Netflix or the back corner of, I say, not in a literal sense, but some of these more obscure things, maybe more low budget. There's a lot of good gems out there, and also out on YouTube. And I say this to anybody that wants to be an artist: don't go crawling to the establishment. This establishment is dying a slow, painful death right now. Go out and just create your own stuff, create a new establishment from that, and do what is genuine to you. Now, you mentioned in this article too, and this was so obvious, but how the media manipulation really increased after September 11th. Now, I was in high school for the time before 9/11. I was at the end of college when 9/11 happened, and I guess I was technically in the adult world once we started the post-9/11 world. And so for me, this was so shocking because it was so obvious that I could see it. There was always media manipulation before, but it really did go into hyperdrive and really woke a lot of people up to the fact that it was there to begin with. But can you talk about this?
Right. There were two things. I got this from Nick Davies, who is an independent journalist from Britain. And he said since 9/11, there are two reasons why media manipulation has increased. And one is the advent of the internet, and the other is 9/11 itself. So what's happened is the Pentagon has gotten very involved now in media manipulation and propaganda. Now that we have the internet, we have an expansion of media. And so now we find a plethora of fake websites and blogs, which are all put up by the Pentagon and looking like they're put up by grassroots people to manage people's perceptions. It's called perception management about various issues. They have another arm, a fifth arm, which they call information operations. And this fifth arm, they say that the goal of this fifth arm is to dominate the information battle space. And the fifth arm will be as powerful and will have the same autonomy as the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Special Operations, and the fifth arm would be this information operations. In other words, there's huge resources going into propaganda by the Pentagon. And another analysis I read that no matter who it is, whether it's the NSA, the Pentagon, the State Department, whoever it is that's propagandizing Americans or abroad, the CIA, I don't know if I can, this is just another person's analysis, but they said the CIA controls the final product. So that's one person's analysis. I can't say for sure that's true. So anyway, yes, it has increased incredibly after 9/11 and the manipulation of the media.
Well, and you can see them throttling the internet. When I say throttle, I don't mean your access to be able to get on the internet. That's typically the where that term is used, but just the information that is available to you. Now, someone listening to this will say, but I can go on YouTube and get lots of information. Look, the internet is different now than it was when I first started waking up to 9/11 and researching things. When I first started waking up to this, you could find videos from people. They were usually pretty low budget because the person really just cared about getting the info out. Some of them looked like they were shot on a VHS recorder, but the information was so compelling that you watched it. You didn't care about the quality of the picture and all of this. There were movies that were made that were just focused on giving you information. Over time now, I've seen them shift so that now you have all of these videos out there that are trying to put up this front as if they are an alternative media channel. It'll be some 40-year-old guy dressed like he's 15, referring to what he's talking about as a conspiracy theory, which, I mean, look, when you talk about 9/11 and you believe it was a controlled demolition, you don't refer to your own information as a conspiracy theory. That's a good sniff test for the listener, and if you're on the other side working for the CIA listening to this, that's where you screw up. Our taxpayer dollars are paying you to do your job very poorly. But basically, they'll do this, and it's just overloaded with a bunch of nonsense. I was trying to watch something just to go to bed to last night, and they would put up this information about 10 really... There are always these top 10 lists, and it's these 10 really bogus things, half of which I know were debunked, and then you try to look into maybe 2 of them from the remaining 5, and you can find that those have been debunked too. Just provably false things to get you distracted talking about mermaids or Bigfoot or whatever nonsense is out there, and keep your focus away from the stuff that actually has merit to it, of course, like our issue and other issues. But it's been very changed, and the serious voices are being drowned out by the people that are just trying to become celebrities. Those are the actors that appear in these. They think they can use this as a niche to try to get fame and fortune at some point, and whoever is behind them and promoting them to the very top, turning our side of things into a cartoon, a caricature. So that's what I see is happening right now. Have you noticed that?
I really haven't. You probably watch more than I do, and I haven't noticed it that much, but it makes sense. It's a much more sophisticated way to get propaganda into the public view. One thing that does discourage me is I see, for example, when I watch the Young Turks, to see what their analysis is on things going on, they're constantly using the term conspiracy theory. And I'm going, why are you doing this? It's like, you're supposed to be progressive, but they're constantly using the term conspiracy theory. And I don't know if it's just obligatory, they have to use this so they can look credible or what. But I just go, you're just really validating propaganda here when you're constantly using the term conspiracy theory. So I've noticed that. But I haven't noticed what you're saying so much. It does make sense what you're saying.
So, yeah, I'm all about solutions on this show, and we've barely even scratched the surface, but I don't want to give away the whole article here on this show. The audience is going to have to go read it when it's up at ae911truth.org, and I encourage you to do it, because if you really want to understand the background of what is keeping the 9/11 World Trade Center evidence from being put on your TV in your living room, you got to read Fran's article. She really does go in depth. Please check it out. But when you read it, I could see how some people, because this is a societal issue here in America, some people can get depressed. It's like, oh man, they're in control of everything, and it seems like they always have been, at least for a very long time. It's stuff that can be depressing if you just focus on it and lose perspective of the bigger picture of overall life. I mean, the situation is difficult that we're in, but you don't have to get mired in apathy and negativity. And I don't think anyone can change the world until they have their own house in order and learn to accept the situation. Don't accept it to the point where you just wave your hand and say, that's the way things are. You do something about it, but you learn to deal with the situation that we're in. The fact that everybody's being propagandized by an entity that is way out of control and suppressing information like the information about 9/11. So, Fran, I want to hear from you in your own personal perspective. Even though the media is controlled and the unjust rule over the just, what can the average listener do to keep themselves mentally in the game and not get turned to apathy because they're intimidated by the enormity of all of this?
That's a good question. And again, it's going to depend on the person, what they need. First of all, the first thing that comes to me is find people of like mind. And here where I live in Denver, that's been relatively easy. We have a group of people and we get to talk to each other and throw ideas back and forth. And so we find people we can talk to. And this is an international movement, so if you can't find people in your own community, there's people out there in other communities that you can find and email and talk to on the phone. There's also, if you find yourself becoming really disturbed, like full of anxiety and not losing sleep and that sort of thing. I mean, I'm a psychotherapist, so I highly recommend psychotherapy. Now, finding someone who will listen to you and take you seriously is something you need to do. There's lots of people out there doing psychotherapy, and not all of them are going to listen to you. Some of them will think you're crazy if you talk about 9/11, but there are others who will listen. I know for myself, when I first started looking into this whole issue, I had a lot of anxiety, and it was bringing up a lot of fear, and I had nights where I couldn't sleep. And the thought was, my goodness, if they can do this, they can do anything. Should I leave the country? And I knew enough about myself to know that it's a possibility that this anxiety was coming from old trauma. And so I did get into psychotherapy. I found out, yes, the anxiety was coming from what I learned about 9/11 was triggering old traumatic events in my life. And so when I started working through those old traumatic events, suddenly I could do the same work I was doing with 9/11. I could do the same activism and not be triggered by the anxiety. I could come from a place of love and compassion from the people I was talking to and not feel like I have to shake people to get them to wake up. So that's one thing, is if you need psychotherapy, it's a wonderful thing. You'll find yourself growing and becoming a better person. On the other hand, if you just need people to talk to, then that's great. Find people to talk to, but don't remain isolated and doing in all of this, because that's probably not going to lead down a constructive road. Can you think of anything else, Andy? That's what comes to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think keeping a historical perspective, and when you say don't become isolated, just because somebody doesn't want to hear about 9/11, or maybe they even slightly agree with you, but they're concerned about other things, doesn't mean you need to just turn them off completely because they're not a full-on board 9/11 truther. You don't want to isolate yourself from the rest of society, and just because a particular person, if you've got everything else in common except this, or they're just not as fascinated with this issue as you are, doesn't mean that you need to cut them out of your life. Some people make that mistake, and I think it's a huge mistake. And it's also realizing what's important. I mean, first of all, we're in a sort of unique situation in history, but if you look at the enormity of it, there's been people in history who've been in the middle of huge civil wars, have had their horrible communist governments, horrible atrocities all around them, yet they managed to have parties and go out and follow the soccer games and things, and they live their lives among it, and just, history happens around them. So you've got people in history who have survived all of this, and why should you be any different? This is just the story of civilization. And remember what is important at the end of the day. You can do your very best. You can put in a day's work on this 9/11 issue, or if you can only be a weekend warrior, that's fine too. You can put your weekend's work in it. But at the end of the day, what's important? Are the people that are chastising you important, or are the people who are in your immediate family or your friends, are they more important? That moment when you're sitting there at the end of the day watching a movie or watching a ball game with the dog. I mean, to me, that is what it all comes down to at the end. And as long as you can keep perspective of that, I think we can survive anything. Any human being can. So that's my advice.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Andy. And keep your life balanced, here in Colorado, we can go out and hike, get exercise and keep your life balanced. And the other thing is keep the perspective, as you were talking about, is exactly right. When you look at other movements that have made a huge difference in our society, You look at the women's movement, for example. Those women were horribly treated. They were jailed, they were abused, they were just terribly, terribly mistreated. But look at what they accomplished in the end. Look at the civil rights movement. I can't believe what those people went through, with being beaten, hosed down, with powerful fire hoses. It's just, it's horrible what they went through. Jailed as children often, and yet, they prevailed. And they went through much more than we're going through. We're not being beaten. We're not being jailed. We're being ridiculed, and we're having to deal with a lot of propaganda, but that's been our challenge.
Right, and I'll just add, keep a sense of humor, too. The thing that powerful people hate the most is to be laughed at. And they're trying to do that to us, but honestly, I just turn it back around on them. I mean, it's so pathetic when you watch the corporate media right now and what they're trying to do. They might as well have sock puppets on somebody's hand talking, and you can see them desperately trying to hold on to their control of the collective human mind, and it's just not working. And to a certain aspect, it's sort of funny to me, and they hate being laughed at. So I think that is a great way to cope. And Fran, we are at the end of the hour here, and it just went by so fast. There's a lot to cover. Of course, it's a big series, and we're not going to cover it all in an hour, but you, the listener, can cover it all by going on to ae911truth.org. You can start in our archives and get a good background, but the name of the series, once again, is Why Do Good People Become Silent or Worse About 9/11? A lot of great reading there. Fran, keep up the awesome work you're doing, and thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Free Fall today.
Right, Andy, and just, what people can do is they can just go to Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, in the search bar there, just put in my name, Francis Shure, and then all the articles will come up. So that's how people can find them. And there you go. Thank you so much, Andy. And I certainly agree with your analysis of keeping a sense of humor. That's really, really important. So thank you so much for all your work, and thanks for listening to me and having this conversation with me.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.